This is chapter 12. Section 6 is about cis-trans isomers. In an alkene, the double bonds between carbon atoms aren't able to rotate the way that the single bonds in an alkane can. That means that all four atoms that are attached to the carbons in a double bond are held in a fixed position. We can't rotate one side relative to the other to transform it into a new conformation. If we imagine that we take one side and we do swap the atoms attached to that carbon, we'll sometimes get an entirely new molecule. If that new molecule is different enough from the first that it can't be obtained from a simple rotation, then what we've really found is an isomer. This phenomena is called cis-trans isomerization. In this section, we're going to learn how to draw the condensed structural formulas and name these kinds of cis-trans isomers. If you recall, in an alkane, you are able to rotate around the single bonds between the carbon atoms. So if you had a case where you had different substituents on two adjacent carbon atoms, like so, you could just rotate around this central bond to change it into another conformation. In this case, rotating the right-hand side would cause the bromine to rotate down into the bottom position, next to the first bromine that's also pointing down. In this case, we have two molecules that are really the same. Because you're able to freely rotate around that inner bond, that single bond, there's no difference between these two, and in fact, they're constantly spinning around and converting from one conformation to the other at all times. In an alkene, however, we no longer have a single bond between the carbons. We have a double bond. That double bond is rigid and does not rotate, and so we're not able to do the same thing. We also have to remember that when we add another bond between the carbons, we have to get rid of one of the bonds that's already there. So in a case like this, what we end up with are two different isomers, the cis and the trans isomers. These are called geometric isomers because they differ in the shape around certain bonding points. These different molecules have different chemical and physical properties due to their different structures, and so we need to give them unique names. So we apply the cis or the trans designation as a prefix in front of the name of the compound. As I said, the different structures of the cis and trans isomers of an alkene give them different physical and chemical properties. This means we need to be able to tell them apart and even assign them unique names, which is where the cis-trans designations come in. So which is which? How do we know which one is considered the cis isomer and which one is considered the trans isomer? Well, the idea is pretty simple. We just take a line and draw it along through the double bond itself. We use the double bond itself as sort of a dividing line between two halves of the molecule. And then we take a look at one of the substituents on each carbon atom that's the same. So in this case, there's a methyl substituent on the first carbon and another methyl on the second carbon in the double bond. Since these two substituents are on the same side of the line, this is considered a cis isomer. Cis means same side. We can view the same thing from the other structures drawn here. If you have just a line angle formula, then drawing this line here and seeing the two substituents pointed upwards, or if they're both downwards, it would be the same as long as they're both pointing on the same side of the line, then we would indicate a cis configuration. And you can see the same thing again here with the three-dimensional structure. For the trans isomer, you again use the double bond itself as the dividing line between the two halves of the molecule. Make sure your line is going parallel, collinear with the double bond, not through it perpendicular. And then you look at where the substituents are. Here you have a methyl, one pointing up, and another methyl pointing down on the other side, the other carbon. Since these are on opposite sides, one is across the line from the other, this is called the trans configuration, and this is trans 2-butene. Again, you can see the same thing here where you draw the line through the line angle formula, and you have one substituent pointing up and one pointing down, and here again with the three-dimensional structure. Obviously, sometimes these would be in a different orientation, so it's not always going to be pointing up and pointing down, but pointing to the same side or pointing to opposite sides. You have to be careful though, because not every alkene has cis and trans isomers. For instance, we see here two different molecules that might at first look like they're cis and trans. If we consider the dividing line through this here, and we look at this hydrogen and this hydrogen, we can see that they're on opposite sides, and so we might want to call that trans. And here we can see that they're on the same side, so we might want to call that cis. But again, we have to be very careful. Think about what happens when you take half the molecule and you swap the atoms attached to one of the carbons. In this case, we would flip this side of the molecule so that the methyl group comes down and the hydrogen comes up. In that case, you would end up with this structure here. But, as I said, it's only an isomer if you can't get there by just rotating the original molecule. So here in the middle, we see a three-dimensional structure corresponding to the original configuration on the left. You have the double bond carbons in the middle, and then the CH3 is pointed upwards. But if you take this molecule and you simply rotate it 180 degrees this way, you end up with the configuration here on the right-hand side. So even though we swapped two of the atoms, it didn't matter because the two atoms on the other carbon were identical. And so relative to those, there was no change in the molecule. That means that these molecules aren't isomers of one another, they're simply the same molecule rotated differently. That means that this is not a case of cis-trans isomerism, and we can just name this. In this case, it's 3 carbons, and so it's propene. The double bond is on the first carbon, but there's no other choice for propene, so we don't have to call it 1-propene. And in fact, this is just propene, and so is this. So the rule here is that if one of the carbons in the double bond has 2 atoms attached to it that are identical, or 2 substituents, entire groups attached to it that are identical, then there's no cis-trans isomer. Both carbons have to have 2 different substituents, or 2 different atoms or groups attached to them in order to have this isomerization. Let's take a look at a few more examples of naming alkenes, keeping in mind that we may need to include the cis-trans designation at the beginning. So we have 3 different structures here, and let's take a look at how they should be named. In all 3 cases, you have 2 carbon atoms attached by a double bond. So all of these are actually derivatives of ethene. The ETH prefix means 2 carbons, and the ENE ending means there's a double bond. Since there's only one place for this double bond to go, we don't need a number for ethene, so we can just stick with that. This first example on the left-hand side has 2 bromine substituents, and so that would be a dibromo as a prefix. We need to indicate what carbons those are on. One is on this carbon and the other is on this carbon, so whether you count from left to right or right to left, it doesn't matter. One is going to be on the first carbon and the other is going to be on the second carbon. So this is 1,2-dibromo. If we then take another look at this and use our understanding of cis-trans isomers, we can draw a dividing line here, and we find that the 2 bromines are on the same side. So in fact, this is cis 1,2-dibromo ethene. For the second one, we have pretty much the same thing, but if we look at our dividing line, we'll see that the 2 bromines, which are still on the 1 carbon and the 2 carbon, are on opposite sides of the line. And so this is trans 1,2-dibromo ethene. And so that leaves the last one. We can look and use our dividing line, but we have to be careful because at first it looks like you have a bromine on top and a bromine on bottom, which would be a trans configuration. But these are on the same carbon. So in fact, there's no cis-trans isomers here at all. If we flipped one side of this molecule relative to the other, we would just get the same molecule back. It should be pretty clear for you to see that this molecule really has a line of symmetry through this. Right? So both carbons actually have identical atoms attached to them. That means that we don't use cis-trans isomers for this. So what is the name of this? Well, in this case, both bromines are actually attached to the same carbon. So while it's still a dibromo ethene, it's not 1,2-dibromo ethene. They're both attached to the first carbon, so we would call that carbon number 1. And we would call this 1,1-dibromo ethene. Remember, even if they're attached to the same carbon, you have to give a number for each of them. In this case, this is an isomer of the other two, but it's not a cis-trans isomer. It's another kind of structural isomer. Let's take a look at a few more examples. In the first one, A, we just have a 2-carbon chain with a double bond between them. So this is, again, an ethene derivative. We've got 2 chlorine substituents on different carbons in the double bond, and the other sides of those are hydrogens. So each of these carbons has 2 different atoms going to it, which means we can think about cis-trans isomers for this. Both chlorine groups are on the same side of the dividing line that you would draw, and so this is cis 1,2-dichloroethene. Ethene because it's a 2-carbon chain with a double bond, dichloro because it has 2 chlorines, 1, 2 because 1 chlorine is on the first carbon and 1 is on the second carbon, and cis because they're both on the same side of this dividing line. For B, we actually have a 4-carbon chain. You have to remember that even though the picture is drawn this way to emphasize the arrangement of atoms around the central double bond, you can't just ignore this carbon and this carbon. Those are part of the 4-carbon chain. So in fact, we start numbering at either end. It would be the same way whichever carbon we start with. So we can start here with this is 1, this would be 2, this would be 3, and this would be 4. So we have a 4-carbon chain with a double bond starting on carbon number 2. That means this is 2-butene. Now there's no other substituents to add as prefixes, but if you draw the line between or going through the double bond, then you'll see that you do have what looks like a methyl substituent, one pointing up and one pointing down. Now it's not really a methyl substituent, it's part of the carbon chain, but it's something attached to the double bonded carbon that makes it different. And so since this group is on opposite sides of the line, this is actually trans 2-butene. Remember, another way to write this would be trans-but-2-ene. Just remember to put a dash also between the trans prefix and the rest of the name of the compound. For the last one, we can take a look at either of the carbons in the double bond and see that for both carbons, they have identical atoms attached. This left carbon has 2 hydrogens attached, and this right carbon has 2 methyl groups attached. So whichever one we look at, we see that this is going to be a completely symmetrical molecule. If we flip one side relative to the other, we're not going to get a new compound. So there are no cis-trans isomers here. But we still need to think about how to identify the carbon chain. Obviously, it can't be this one because our carbon chain has to include the double bond. So once we include these 2 carbons, then we can use either of the others as the last carbon in the chain. So if we look at it like that, then it's a 3-carbon chain with a double bond and a methyl group attached to the central carbon. A 3-carbon chain with a double bond is going to be called propene. No number is necessary because there's only one possible structure of propene. But this methyl group is attached to the second carbon, the middle carbon. Start counting from either side and it'll be attached to carbon number 2. So that means that this is 2-methyl propene. The difference in chemical and physical properties between cis and trans isomers actually plays an important role in many biological processes. So for example, this picture here shows bombicol, a sex pheromone produced by the female silkworm moth. The shape of a pheromone is very important to the way that it functions. And so if this particular molecule had any configuration other than a trans double bond here and a cis double bond here, it wouldn't produce the same biochemical response in this moth, and it wouldn't act as a pheromone. Another example where this is important is in human vision. Our sense of sight depends on the light-induced cis-trans isomerization of a molecule called retinol. You can see here a structure of retinol in the cis configuration about this double bond in particular. This molecule is embedded in a protein that's part of a membrane of a cell that's in the retina of your eye. So when light hits this particular molecule, it can break this double bond and allow this arm to stretch out. The double bond can then reform into the trans configuration. In this new extended shape, however, the molecule no longer fits as nicely into the protein, and so it starts to get pushed out. This triggers a cascade of chemical reactions that results in a buildup of sodium ions and eventually gets transformed into an electrochemical nerve signal that gets all the way to your brain, which then processes it as vision.